Today, we will learn and reflect on critical race theory and what these words mean to both academics and ordinary people. Both concerned parents and activists who have no children have been flooding school board meetings across the country, yelling and screaming and threatening each other over critical race theory and how our teachers teach our children American history. What should we teach our students about slavery, abolition, the Civil War and Reconstruction, and the Jim Crow Redemptionist era and civil rights movements? Do we teach our white children that black lives really do matter? And I would like to remind our gentle listeners that Black Lives Matter is more a movement than an organization, and that critical race theory has absolutely nothing to do with communism. Telling my personal story, I graduated from high school in 1975 and I took advanced history classes. And I can tell you I was totally ignorant of the truly ugly Civil War, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow history of this country. Not only was I ignorant of this history, I can share with you the passage in Doris Kearns' book on FDR and Eleanor that opened mine eyes to the true nature of the civil rights struggles. And these Kearns slides are from my video where we review how the Nazi lawyers used the Jim Crow precedents in framing the Jewish race laws soon after Hitler hijacked the German democracy. The Nazis, on the night of the Kristallnacht, which is the night of broken glass, greatly increased their persecution of the Jews by burning, looting, and vandalizing Jewish businesses, synagogues, and residences. And soon after, they sent most Jews to their death in the concentration camp and work camps. This same type of violence has been practiced in the Deep South by the KKK and other racist terrorists. Likely tens of thousands of Negroes have been lynched in the years since the end of the Civil War in the Deep South and Midwest. And mine eyes were open when I first read about the history of the defeat of the anti-lynching bills in 1938. Eleanor Roosevelt and the black leaders were pushing FDR in Congress to pass the anti-lynching bill when the entire world was witnessing the horrors of the Nazi persecutions of the Jews. FDR was sympathetic. He explained to a colleague that the Southerners, by reason of the seniority rule in Congress, are chairmen of the key congressional committees. If I come out for the anti-lynching bills, they will block every bill I ask Congress to pass to keep America from collapsing, and I just can't take that risk. So FDR had a choice. He could fight the Nazis, or he could fight lynching, but he could not do both. And also, defeating the Nazis was attainable. Eleanor persisted in public speeches and in her newspaper column in supporting the anti-lynching campaign, constantly badgering her husband. Once she asked FDR, "Do you mind if I say what I think?" And FDR replied, "You can say anything you like. I can always say, well, that is my wife. I can't do anything about her." This supposed conflict was a good political way to push for civil rights without unduly antagonizing the powerful Deep South senators and congressmen. What is so distressing about this legislative history was that the bill was not against lynching itself, but it sought to put legal pressure on Southern judges and policemen just to enforce the law and punish those who were guilty of lynching instead of just ignoring these murders. Now, was I taught in school about the famous black leaders like Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington or W.E.B. Du Bois? No, they taught us about the safe black leader George Washington Carver, who taught Southern farmers how to nurture their soil by planting peanuts and sweet potatoes, and how you can make many things from peanuts and sweet potatoes like milk, butter, cheese, coffee, flour, soap, ink, candy, soap, cosmetics, and even shaving lotion. And talking about peanuts and sweet potatoes is so much safer than talking about the Civil War and KKK night riders and lynching and civil rights and slavery and such things. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources we use for this video and my blogs that cover the topic. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. While many white protesters at school board meetings only have a vague notion of what critical race theory means, other than somehow it's a communist plot by blacks, or that it intends to make white people feel guilty about themselves for their country, in essence they want teachers to teach their white children some variation of the lost cause myth, that the Civil War was not caused by slavery, that the Civil War was fought for states' rights, and that the North should not have invaded the South by arms. Now, I must admit, I've never had any personal experience being a black person. Well, because I'm not black. And never will be. But I can relate that when my group discussed this video script, one black lady related that her daughter's white teacher taught her class that blacks were somehow inferior to whites. So, literally, our educators, in reality, have a stark choice. Do we wish to make our black children feel inferior, or do we wish to make our white children feel guilty? Now, personally, I don't feel guilty for the historical actions of whites 100 years ago, especially since my grandparents came over on a ship from Norway and Sweden, and I don't believe that we should go out of our way to make our white children feel guilty, but just as the Jews never want us to forget the Holocaust, likewise, we should never forget our own ugly history of the KKK night riders and lynchings, so this ugly history does not repeat itself. So what is critical race theory? What's the academic definition? And what is the perceived definition as most people understand it? Well, we all know that Dr. Wikipedia knows everything, and his definition seems reasonable. So let's ask him first, and we'll also ask Fox News. And Dr. Wikipedia says, critical race theory is a cross-disciplinary intellectual movement that began in the United States in the 60s as the landmark civil rights laws were being eroded and schools were being resegregated. And the liberal notion of value-neutral laws had a significant political role in maintaining a racially unjust social order, where formerly colorblind laws continue to have racially discriminatory outcomes. In other words, what they're trying to say is, we're not truly colorblind. We have a stark choice. We can either strive not to discriminate, or we can pretend that discrimination is not an issue. The only situation I've encountered when there's no discrimination at all is when a friend of mine tried out for the symphony orchestra. Their auditions are performed behind a curtain, so the musicians are only judged on how beautifully they play their instruments, not on their appearance, nor on whether they are beautiful themselves. Now, psychologists have confirmed that, indeed, beautiful and attractive people have more self-confidence and are generally more successful in both their careers and their lives. And critical race theory, to an extent, simply confirms this ugly truth of life. And we can see this as we continue pondering Dr. Wikipedia's explanation. One tenet of CRT is that racism and disparate racial outcomes are the result of complex changes and also subtle dynamics rather than explicit and intentional prejudices. In other words, relationships of all sorts are complicated. And a key CRT concept is intersectionality, how differences in equality and identity are affected by race, class, gender, and disability. In other words, critical race theory itself is actually complicated. And academic critics of CRT argue that it's based on storytelling instead of evidence and reason, and it rejects the concept of truth and merit and opposes liberalism. In other words, opponents say that critical race theory is really reverse racism. And we were asking Dr. Google about what everybody else thought about this. This seemed to be a good statement of the critical race theory by Brookings. And Fox News has mentioned critical race theory 1,300 times in less than 4 months. Why? Because critical race theory has become a new boogeyman for people unwilling to acknowledge our country's racist history and how it impacts the present. To understand why CRT has become such a flashpoint in the culture, it's important to understand what it is and what it is not. Opponents fear that critical race theory admonishes all white people for being oppressors, while classifying all black people as hopelessly oppressed victims. And according to Fox News, what exactly is critical race theory? And the answer to that question has appeared to elude many. Often compared by critics to actual racism, critical race theory is a school of thought that generally focuses on how power structures and institutions impact racial minorities. Race, according to this view, is a relatively recent social construct that is weaponized by dominant groups to oppress others. Now, I doubt that. Certain buzzwords like systemic racism or implicit bias have emerged in school districts' diversity statements, corporate trainings, educational materials, and governmental agencies. And part of the problem in defining CRT is its contours are so vague. Well, you can define CRT in both the academic and its popular senses. And that vagueness is played out nationwide, with institutions disputing constituents' claim that they're implementing CRT. In the fallout of this mass confusion, many have focused their criticism on what they say critical race theory manifests, which is divisive ideas about race, collective guilt for dominant groups, and assigning racial significance to seemingly neutral concepts. Critics, however, say it's a form of neo-racism that's ripping apart society, And that's why conservative activists have pursued a legal strategy of challenging CRT-based trainings through civil rights lawsuit. And one of these activists says, critical race theory is a grave threat to the American way of life. It divides Americans by race and traffics in the pernicious concepts of race essentialism, racial stereotyping, and race-based segregation, all under a false pursuit of social justice. Well, if you were black, you wouldn't think that. And he continues, critical race theory training programs have become commonplace in academia, government, and corporate life, where they have sought to advance the ideology through cult-like indoctrination, intimidation, and harassment. Well, I've been to one of those training sessions when we got bought out by a really big company, and I might admit it was kind of awkward, but, hey, what it did tell the employees is, the corporation is not in favor of, race discrimination, so watch yourself, which is good. In other words, critical race theory, whatever it is not supposed to be taught to our white school children. And this is by force of law in many former Confederate and Republican states. I must admit right off the bat that the only practical way to satisfy the Fox News conservative crowd is to essentially teach a version of history that's equivalent to the lost cause myth, which may be the only way to teach both sides in Fox speak. And so we'll go over what was taught to be the lost cause myth. And this was that the Civil War was fought for states' rights, fought against northern aggressors, and that slaves in the Deep South were happy and well treated by their masters, and that the Civil War was not fought over slavery but states' rights, and that the cause of the Confederacy was just, heroic, and chivalric, and the KKK Knight Riders were like knights in shining armor, and Northern carpetbaggers and Southern scalawags, both who tried to help the black people, and ignorant Negroes took advantage of white Southerners. And the chivalric Knight Riders of the KKK sought to protect and preserve the chastity of white womanhood. And lynching was justified as necessary to protect white womanhood. Now, many of the racial tropes of the Jim Crow system were reinforced in the 1915 movie Birth of a Nation. The first iteration of the KKK had been closed down by federal troops during Reconstruction, and this film led to the rebirth of the KKK. The Birth of a Nation was screened at the White House, and this part of the movie quotes the racist Southern president, Woodrow Wilson, that the great Ku Klux Klan sprang into existence to protect the Southern country is likely an authentic quote. We also see the tropes in these shots of the movie that the blacks who were elected to the state legislatures during Reconstructions were all ignorant, and that black legislators were always prone to manipulation by Northern carpetbaggers and Southern scalawags, shouting and carousing and putting their feet on their desks, and worst of all, eating fried chicken during chaotic legislative sessions. And we also see the trope of the Ivanhoe-like chivalric Knight Riders of the KKK protecting Southern womanhood from the ravages of raging, bug-eyed black stallions. The Birth of the Nation was both an unapologetically racist movie, shocking many even in the pre-war times in 1950, leading to many communities banning this film from their local theaters. But it was also a technologically groundbreaking film in the history of filmmaking. The movie was the longest movie of the time by a long shot, running for a full 3 hours, using revolutionary filming techniques, which you can read about in Roger Ebert's review of this historical film. Let's get some quick background on the nature of slavery itself. This is a slide from our video on slaves in the ancient world, which lists the types of slaves, from the least worst to the most worstest. Now, if you were working for a kind or ambivalent master, the best kind of slave you could be would be a household slave, unless your master was particularly cruel, or for slave girls, unless your master was particularly lecherous, since sexual assault or concubines was a problem in all systems of slavery, both ancient and modern. And this picture shows how most slaves in both the ancient and modern worlds were sold buck naked, so the buyer could see exactly what he was buying, and that's particularly the case when he was buying slave girls. And the worst type of slave you could be was a field slave. They lived and worked under some of the worst conditions. The movie Gone with the Wind, which is the picture most whites have of slavery, is misleading in that every slave in the movie is a household slave. There were no field slaves in Gone with the Wind. Whereas in real life, a plantation that size would work dozens or even hundreds of slaves in the field, laboring under the hot sun and suffering under the whips of cruel overseers. Now, are you a teacher looking for a way to truly teach both sides that does not distort history, Perhaps you'll be allowed to simply teach the history behind the different schools of historical interpretation. Now, historians have often observed the history is written by the winning side of the war. The American Civil War was an exception. The Civil War was the rare conflict where the Confederacy, whose armies were defeated, stubbornly insisted on writing the history of the rebellion not as a struggle to defend slavery, but as a great lost cause, the chivalric struggle for states' rights. Now, what did the American history books teach in the decades following the Civil War and Reconstruction? The noted historian Eric Foner summarizes the predominant views of William Dunning, or the Dunning School, a view which takes the side of the Confederacy. And this is the Dunning School's interpretation. When the Civil War ended, the white South genuinely accepted the reality of military defeat. It stood ready to do justice to the emancipated slaves and desired above all a quick reintegration into the fabric of national life. And Presidents Lincoln and Johnson attempted to carry out a magnanimous policy of presidential reconstruction. But, motivated by irrational hatred of Southern rebels and the desire to consolidate their party's national ascendancy, the radical Republicans in 1867 swept aside the Southern governments Johnson had established and fastened black suffrage upon the defeated South. Oh, heaven forbid. And then followed the sordid period of radical Reconstruction, an era of corruption by unscrupulous carpetbaggers from the North, unprincipled Southern white scalawags, and ignorant black freedmen. And after much needless suffering, the South's white community banded together to overthrow these governments and restore home rule, which is a euphemism for white supremacy and Jim Crow. Reconstruction was seen by the adherents to the Dunning School as the darkest page in the saga of American history. Now, a central tenet of the Dunning School of history was the conviction of Negro incapacity. The childlike blacks, the Dunning scholars insisted, were unprepared for freedom and incapable of properly exercising the political rights Northerners had thrust upon them. And the historian and black activist W.E.B. Du Bois viewed the Dunning School as promoting a Southern white fairy tale, but more dangerously, a narrative that encouraged racial discrimination and supported white supremacy. To combat this, Du Bois published the book Black Reconstruction in 1935, and it was preceded by several articles in the Atlantic magazine. Black Reconstruction earned excellent reviews from the New York Times, but it was rejected and ridiculed by the segregationist Southern historians of the Dunning School. In their view, the Reconstruction era was a dark and corrupt era. W.E.B. Du Bois, who earned his Ph.D. from Harvard, countered with his history of the Civil War and Reconstruction from 1860 to 1880, and he sought to show that, in contrast, the years when blacks were guaranteed the civil rights and suffrage was a bright era in American history, an era of democracy and great achievement. The thought that a black man could write such a scholarly work was seen as ludicrous by Southern historians, and this book was virtually ignored until the 1960s civil rights movement. And we pulled a few slides from our video on the Black Reconstruction to give you an idea of his message. And a Southerner wrote, "In the upper states as much attention is paid to the breeding and growth of Negroes as those of horses and mules. Further south, we raise them both for use and for market. Planters command their slave girls, married and unmarried, to have children, and I've known a great many Negro girls to be sold off because they did not have children. And a breeding woman is worth from 1/6 to 1/4 more than one that does not breed. And you must keep in mind that before the Civil War, slaves, in today's dollars, were worth as much as a new economy car. And the total value of slaves was actually worth more than the value of the plantations themselves." And one of his subheads is how the Negro became free because the North could not win the Civil War if he remained in slavery. How arms in his hands and the prospect of arms in a million more black hands brought peace and emancipation to America. In other words, the blacks really played a pivotal role in helping to win the Civil War. After the Civil War, blacks were often killed. A former Mississippi slaveholder wrote, "General Chet Lane of Mississippi tells us that while he was in command on 9 counties, there was an average of 1 black man killed every day. And then in moving out 40 miles on an expedition, he found 7 Negroes wantonly butchered. General Thomas of the Freedmen's Bureau tells us that on an average 2 or 3 black men are killed daily in Mississippi. And the sable patriot in blue, he's referring to the black Union soldiers, as they return, are the objects of a special spite. And his subhead on the chapter of the Reconstruction and Redemptionist Jim Crow Era, Du Bois says this as his subhead: how civil war in the South began again, and indeed has never ceased. And how the black Prometheus, bound to the rock of ages by hate, hurt, and humiliation, has his vitals eaten out as they grow, yet lives and fights. So how did the blacks survive the many injustices of the Reconstruction Era? And Du Bois writes, and he's describing the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, founded by the black leader in the previous generation, Booker T. Washington. Du Bois writes, had it not been for the Negro school and college, the Negro would have been driven back into slavery. His economic foothold in land and capital was too slight in 10 years of turmoil. His Reconstruction leadership had come from Negroes educated in the North, and white politicians, capitalists, and philanthropic teachers. But through establishing public schools and private colleges, and by organizing the Negro Church, the Negro had acquired enough leadership and knowledge to thwart the worst designs of the new slave drivers. They avoided the mistake of trying to meet force by force. They bent to the storm of beating, lynching, and murder, but kept their souls in spite of public and private insult of every description. Now, if you want to examine black history in another both sides approach, you can compare and contrast the life stories of the pull-yourself-up-by-your-own-bootstraps educator Booker T. Washington and the black activist W.E.B. Du Bois, co-founder of the NAACP. In my humble opinion, to truly understand black history, you need to study the writings of both of these black leaders. Now, more people need to listen to my video on my friend Booker, because he's quite upset that for every 40 people who listen to my W.E.B. Du Bois Black Reconstruction video, only one person listens to my Booker T. Washington video. Now, up to the current day, black history can be seen as the tension between accommodating black leaders like Booker T. Washington's, who believe that blacks should not complain but rather work harder and smarter, and black activists like W.E.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass, who encourage blacks to speak up and demand their civil rights. Now, to review this evolution of the civil rights struggle, let us review the prominent black leaders from these three generations. Now, Frederick Douglass was born a slave in 1818, and he escaped to freedom. He was a prominent abolitionist, orator, writer, and activist, and he always pushed for greater civil rights for blacks. He died in 1895 at the ripe old age of 78. And in the second generation of black leaders, Booker T. Washington was also born a slave in 1856 and was emancipated at the end of the Civil War. He learned to read and write, attended college, and founded the Tuskegee Institute. He lived through the darkest days of Jim Crow racism, where lynchings were at their peak. He promoted the values of trade education for blacks so they could realistically get a job that would not threaten whites. As his school prospered, he spent more and more time fundraising from rich white businessmen like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, so he did not push hard for civil rights, although he tactfully supported black suffrage and opposed lynchings. W.E.B. Du Bois was born a free man during the Reconstruction years in 1868 in Massachusetts, so he did not suffer the extreme discrimination until he attended college in the Deep South. He became a college professor, the first black to earn a Ph.D. at Harvard, and was part of the Talented Tenth movement, which encouraged a classical liberal education for black leaders. He was a co-founder of NAACP and was a vigorous civil rights activist. Like Booker, W.E.B. Du Bois was 95 when he died in 1963, just a few years shy of the passage of civil rights legislation. Now, Du Bois and Booker were frenemies. They are enemies in public. The accommodationists battling the activists, but also friends in private. Booker T. Washington actually helped fund the NAACP, but he had to be careful. If his wealthy white donors saw him as a civil rights activist, then they would cease to donate to the black universities that the whites saw as institutions that would educate a docile black workforce. Now, the black conservative Thomas Sowell, who was born in 1930, has some interesting comments in an essay on Booker T. Washington. And Sowell also observes that during his tenure at the head of the Tuskegee Institute, there was never a whiff of financial scandal, which is noteworthy in any institution that raises and spends such large sums of money. And you could say that Sowell is a modern black educator following in the footsteps of Booker T. Washington. And he writes, Booker T. Washington privately not only supported efforts to safeguard civil rights, but also wrote anonymous newspaper articles protesting the violation of these rights, as did his trusted agents. He secretly financed legal challenges to Jim Crow laws, sometimes secretly paying the legal fees for black defendants. And Booker T. Washington also worked behind the scenes to get federal appointments for blacks in Washington and postmaster appointments in Alabama, as well as lobbying presidents to appoint federal judges who would give blacks a fair hearing. It would not be surprising that blacks and liberals prefer the activist approach of Du Bois, while whites and conservatives prefer the conciliatory approach of Booker T. Washington. But the reality is that both approaches are the correct approach depending on the situation, and to a certain extent, the approach selected is a personal preference. Sometimes in the long run, it would be best for a black worker to work hard and prove themselves. But on the other hand, sometimes an activist approach is needed for blacks to be even given a chance. For example, during the early civil rights era during World War II, there were horror stories of educated blacks holding PhDs who were only able to find janitorial jobs. Now, another both sides discussion is how the evangelical church avoids discussions of civil rights by emphasizing personal salvation. Since the end is near, we do not need to worry about reforming society, and that causes too much trouble anyway. And we have a video on the books written by Robert P. Jones exploring these issues. Jones remembers that as a youth, in his words, I memorized scriptures, agonized episodically over whether or not I was truly saved, kept daily prayer journals, and read the Bible cover to cover over the course of a year in high school, and even worked for Billy Graham for a time. And he remembers there was not any emphasis on pondering the history of the churches during and after the Civil War. He remembers, I generally knew that there had been a split between Northern and Southern Baptists, but the narrative was vague. As a side comment, that split still exists today. His high school education at the time taught that the true causes of the Civil War were complicated. And Jones also says that he was taught that slavery was not the central issue, but merely one of many North-South conflicts precipitating the split. And in this video he discussed how historically evangelicals justified slavery and ignored civil rights issues. And he has some insights into Southern Baptist evangelicals. And he relates the historical debates where Negroes were seen as inferior and explores the past biblical justification for slavery. He explores the horror of the KKK night riders and lynching and the issue of the Confederate statues and the lost cause, whitewashing the Confederacy and racism, and explores the relationship between evangelicals and the Republican Party and racism, and in particular as they played out in the many presidential elections up to the current day. And here are also some articles on the lost cause that you can look at. And Robert Jones points out that the Christianity the slave owners wanted preached to their slaves and the Christian preaching the slaves were eager to hear were very different. The slave owners wanted the preachers to preach the message of Ephesians to their slaves, for slaves to submit to their masters, for slaves to work as faithfully for their masters as they would work for Jesus. Of course, ignoring the passage in Ephesians that says Christians should submit to one another. And the preaching that the slaves were eager to hear was the hopeful message when Moses relayed God's message to old Pharaoh, let my people go. And we picked the image of Charlton Heston parting the Red Sea as our thumbnail for our video on slavery in the early Jewish and Christian traditions. Since in the Old Testament the Lord often preceded his messages to Israel with this, remember, you were slaves in the land of Egypt. So be compassionate to sojourners, in other words immigrants, and the poor and laborers you encounter. And in the modern world that would include minimum wage workers, I presume. Robert P. Jones quotes a Southern preacher, Christ's enemies could nail him to the cross, but they could not quench the ideals he embodied. Christ's cause seemed to be a lost cause, as the darkness fell on the great tragedy at Calvary. Out of what seemed to be Golgotha's irretrievable defeat has come the cause whose mission is to save which is lost. So how did history books in the Deep South describe Reconstruction? Robert Jones says, Reconstruction was presented as a time when white Southerners were victimized by vengeful, occupying federal Union forces who supported black politicians primarily to humiliate their defeated enemies. The United Daughters of Confederacy even issued a Confederate catechism in Q&A format so children could memorize the proper answer to these questions. Like, how were slaves treated? Answer, with great kindness and care in nearly all cases, a cruel master being rare, and lost the respect of his neighbors if he treated his slaves badly. Question, what was the feeling of the slaves toward their masters? Answer, the slaves were faithful and devoted and were always ready and willing to serve their masters. Question, what causes led to the war between the states? Answer, the disregard on the part of the states of the North for the rights of the southern or slave-holding states. And we'd also like to give credit where credit is due. So we want to draw your attention to Promise Keepers, a Protestant evangelical retreat ministry that struggled over the years, in part because they include racial reconciliation as one of their central messages, despite considerable pushback over the years. And this video reviews the biography and testimony of the founder, Coach McCartney, and an update on the current status of the ministry and its revival meetings. Coach McCartney became aware of the grinding poverty and discrimination many blacks faced when he was recruiting black athletes for his championship-winning college football team, and this deeply influenced his Promise Keepers ministry. We have another both sides discussion about slavery in the antebellum South. One of the many sparks that helped ignite the Civil War was the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The story is when Lincoln met her, he remarked, "This is the little lady who helped start this awful war." Uncle Tom's Cabin was a runaway bestseller, but other Southern authors countered with other novels that sought to sugarcoat slavery. The most successful was Aunt Philip's Cabin. We plan a 2022 video that compares these two novels, and also looks at a companion book Harriet wrote that provided the sources she used to construct her characters. We have yet another both sides discussion about slavery in the ancient world and modern world. One of the strong defenses by slave owners before the Civil War was that the Bible tolerated slavery, which indeed it did. Now this is an interesting topic which we discussed in our two videos on slavery in the ancient world, and how the church fathers in the church over time became less approving of slavery. There were differences of opinion between the church fathers and moral philosophers. For example, Aristotle strongly supported slavery, stating that slaves were slaves by nature, while Seneca insisted that he treated his slaves like they were equals, and even allowed his slaves to dine with him at the family table, and so should you. And we also argued that slaves were the employees of the ancient world, and this broadens the definition of slavery to include what we would call today wage slaves, which are people earning a wage on which it is impossible to live on with dignity. There were many slaves in the ancient world who were chattel slaves, who could be bought and sold like livestock, but as the ready supply of slaves diminished after Rome lost power, the system of serfdom evolved where the serfs were still tied to the land on which they were born and earned very little, but were not the physical property of their lords. Now this looser definition is appealing and beneficial because it suggests that today's minimum wage employees are really slaves with none of the securities middle-class employees enjoy. And this next video continues this discussion of critical race theory. Here we review and reflect on the two books that have been getting a great deal of press, The 1619 Project and Beloved. These books have differing emphases. The 1619 Project really tells what it is like to live in a black skin in America this past 100 years, while Toni Morrison's primary audience for Beloved is other black women like herself. And now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. We quoted from the preface of Eric Foner's book on Reconstruction. Although this is an excellent history, we prefer to do videos on other books that have more personal stories to tell. And we also quoted from the interesting introduction in Black Reconstruction by David Levering Lewis of Rutgers. The video on Black Reconstruction is one of our most viewed videos. And do not forget On Ordinary Times by Doris Kearns and her story of FDR and Eleanor during the war years. We also have a series of 4 blogs which uses their main source, 2 series of undergraduate class lectures from Yale. And these 4 blogs also have links for the Yale class reading lists and their transcripts, and we plan to make videos of these Yale class notes in 2022, and including one on American slavery and the abolitionists, one on stories of how slaves helped the Union win the Civil War, another on post-Civil War Reconstruction and Redemption, and a video on American civil rights history. The YouTube description links to the video script and our blog. Please support our channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons, and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. And please click on the links for interesting videos on other topics that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.